The following program contains archived content. Some of the information may now be out of date.
Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome listeners to Big Little Small Talk. I think it's probably the most unusual place I've ever done an interview. I'm on the stage at the Repertory Theatre because I have the director of an up-and-coming play, Pride and Prejudice, which is going to be performed here soon. But I have the director, Dr. Sherree Halliwell. Welcome to Big Little Small Talk, Sherree.
Thank you, Megan.
Now, I think it'll be the only time I'll ever be on the stage. You're quite used to it. But you have an English accent. Is it true or not true that you have a relation to Sherree Halliwell from the Spice Girls?
You have somehow managed to unearth that one. She's my father's cousin. So, yes, in a roundabout way.
So tell me about your growing up, your English accent.
Yes, I grew up in the north of England and I had a very grim up north kind of an accent then growing up. But when I went to university, I found that that marked me out as, a very different kind of a creature at Oxford. So I attempted to improve my accent and learn a BBC newsreader accent so that I didn't stand out so much. And I wish I hadn't now, because I think probably at the time I was just so nervous and I wasn't really able to be myself. I really felt that my background was something I needed to cover. But it has left me with a sort of a strange semi-BBC's north of England kind of an accent rolled together. And growing up, it was that classic idyllic English countryside childhood that you expect from the storybooks. I grew up on what used to be a farm, and I went to a little country school that only had 6 kids in my year, and so I think I probably had a blessing of a childhood, and really the first time I actually went to a big city, I was already an adult. So I'd never even been to London, the capital city, until I was 19 years of age. So, wow. Yeah, it was a very...
Well, we in Australia are very bad at picking English accents, but I'm sure, yes, you've got a hybrid of lots of different things. I want to talk about you going to Oxford in a little bit, but before I get onto that, I also want to find out if it is true or not that you were doing some set tutoring on the cast of Harry Potter.
You really have done your homework. Yes. So, wow, I'm really impressed at your sources, Megan. That's true too. So, on the cast of Harry Potter, there were a few of them doing their A-levels at around the time of that third movie coming out. And Emma Watson, who plays Hermione Granger in Harry Potter, was doing her geography and history A-levels, and I'd happened to do extraordinarily well in mine when I was doing my A-levels at school, and I knew a friend who was a tutor on on the set of Harry Potter, who said we could really do with some support, so I got rung in for that one. So yes, tutoring Emma Watson, who plays Hermione for her.
Is that in the early days of the Harry Potter series?
Fairly early, but A-levels are done sort of midway through Harry Potter. So A-levels are done between 16 and 18. So if you look at the Harry Potter series, it's that 3rd, 4th, 5th kind of movie time that they're doing the work on A-levels. So yes, it was...
How incredible. Yeah.
It was a great time, yeah.
That's right. Okay, I think you'd have to be the most diverse guest I have ever had, Sherree, and it's just been such a joy sort of finding out all of the things that you have done. But most recently, your most recent role, before we went on to study further, I gather, is that you're a managing director of an international food service business, and you have a background in, a corporate background in advertising, marketing and strategy. So tell me about that part of your life.
Coming out of university, I actually wanted to go into politics, much like you. So I was the treasurer of the Young Liberal Democrats, which in the UK is basically a centre-leaning party. And I had been on their national committee and was anticipating or hoping for a career in politics. But I also happened to be the careers advisor for my college at Oxford. And so I saw all these wonderful graduate opportunities, and it was my job to really match people to those opportunities so they could apply for them. And one came across my desk that I was just captivated by, and it asked for ambidextrous brains. And I thought, wow, something that actually marries the scientific and mathematical with the creative arts, that's right up my street, because I did study philosophy, politics and economics, which is very much an ambidextrous degree. So I applied for that and ended up getting it, which funneled me into marketing. So my career started off in advertising, did quite a lot of big budget ads in Y&R advertising agency. I was headhunted for Diageo, who are an international drinks business, and here you'd know them by Smirnoff and Bundy rum and things like UDL and Johnny Walker and Baileys and these sorts of brands. And that brought me over to Australia. So I was meaning to be here for 4 months, and that was in September 2006, and I've never left.
Okay. What part of Australia did you come to initially?
Initially Sydney. So their head office was in Bondi Junction, which was a beautiful place to land.
So what sort of age were you then when you came out?
Then I was 26, and I actually became an Australian citizen when I was 30. So I'm an Auspom, it should have been 4 months, got extended to 8 months, and then I stayed, mutual opportunity. It came about that at the time Coles and Woolworths wanted to do more shopper marketing, loyalty stuff. So what we know now as Everyday Rewards and Flybuys was in its infancy, and that was the area that I, in the UK, was working on through Tesco, who were a pioneer in that reward space. So they kept me on initially to work on really partnering with Coles and Woolies to improve their Flybuys and Everyday Rewards in the liquor sector, and I ended up staying here. Right. And that then grew from a marketing career from Diageo to Mars to KFC into then more of a general management career in pizza, in Crust Gourmet Pizza and Pizza Capers. And that was a franchise that I was busy growing internationally as well as locally. And with all of that, I then decided to retire a couple of years ago. And I looked towards academia as my next career step, which I call my semi-retirement.
Semi-retirement. Well, we won't want to talk about semi-retirement. We won't want to talk about that. But what were your impressions of coming to Australia? Had you travelled very much when you were a student or in your working life in the UK?
I travelled quite a bit for work meetings whilst I was in the UK. So having gone nowhere up until the age of 19, really, as soon as I started my marketing career, I found I was being sent all over the world. So that really opened my eyes to locations other than my doorstep country town in the UK. And I've always loved travel in different cultures. I've loved understanding people's histories. I hate transit though. So
I don't think I've ever heard someone say, I love being stuck in Doha for 4.5 hours.
Yeah. Being on a plane or being on a train. And so I actually, when I got to Australia and found that anytime you had to travel, you had to be on a plane for 10 hours, I engineered myself into roles where I could be more domestically focused. And Australia is, I think, the country that, for me, having travelled fairly widely now and met with a lot of different cultures and a lot of different histories and peoples, Australia was the place that actually felt most like home. And it's come to feel like home. So now I think of visiting my parents in the UK and that being their home, and I think of Australia as my home.
It does.
I've felt so welcomed. I feel like the culture of Australia, the peoples of Australia, there's something so welcoming about Australians, and I've always felt like I can be my best self here. And I was beginning to feel that wasn't the case in the UK. So
interesting, yeah. Studying philosophy, politics and economics at Oxford, and then coming out to Australia and taking citizenship, I often think about how I would feel taking citizenship of another country, and I think it's a really big deal. And how that felt for you that day, you can probably still remember clearly the day that you did your citizenship ceremony. How did that feel?
I do, and actually I'm not a person who likes photos, which is ironic because my fiance is a photographer, filmographer, and and I hate being photographed. But one of the 4 photos of me in my home is that citizenship photo where I'm proudly holding my certificate and standing next to the mayor, and it meant. It's almost hard to put into words how much it meant to feel that I had become, I suppose, what I'd hoped to become. And I'd, for the previous 5 years, been living in Australia and felt very much like a welcome guest. And the moment that I was sworn as an Australian citizen, I just felt like this was the person I was meant to be. I was meant to be an Australian, meant to represent Australia through the work that I do, and I say now that I'm Australian first, and then I've got that British passport too. I may sound British, but I go for Australia in the cricket, and I'm Australian first now, which has put me in an interesting spot whenever the Ashes comes around with my parents. But
I love that you've said you could be your best self when you're here. And I mean, people talk about a fresh start and the land of opportunity, and it happens, I guess, wherever you go to. But I love the fact that for you, it's you are your best self being here. So it's a lovely thought. So we retire from the corporate world and we decide that we are going to do a PhD in aged care in the community. Tell me what this means. Hang on. The sociology of family care exchanges and the benefits of individuality, tailored age and disability care. Tell me what that means. All those words. What do they mean?
All these words. It's a lot of words. So I springboarded from a master's, which I was looking at adult carers for their parents who cohabit, and quite specifically those adult offspring who come back to care for parents who don't want to go into an aged care facility, do want to remain in their own home, or might have suffered short-term illness that would require a carer but would prefer not to have an outsider in their home or a nurse in their home, or to be taken into care. So my master's was very much focused on those care exchanges between the adult children who either would have to give up their job in order to take on that care role, or were trying to juggle a job at the same time as caring for their adult parents in that situation. And I actually found that was an incredibly positive experience for typically both the parents and the adult offspring, but that there was this stigma that hung about the adult offspring, who quite often, when talking about their circumstances, as I'm living with my mum or dad, people would assume, oh, is that because you failed and you are unable to support yourself? And it got me to thinking that's quite an interesting dynamic. And why is it that we cast people who are obliged to live with their parents as failures? And we use these pejorative terms, failure to launch and boomerang and these sorts of things. So for my PhD, I then moved from that master's into looking at those people who've been obliged to come back to live with parents for whatever reason, economic reason, breakdown of a marriage, in these days, in COVID times, being retrenched from jobs or not being able to find accommodations. And I wanted to see, when they came back to live with parents, what was their experience of that, and particularly if their parents were aged and needed care themselves, whether or not that was a really positive experience for both, where the adult child was able to provide care support that might, for example, normally be provided under the NDIS, and perhaps might allow them to live at home for longer, because typically I was talking to adult kids who might be in their 30s, 40s and so on. So it was that PhD was a really interesting one in understanding potentially how you might solve a social problem of not enough affordable housing for people in their 20s and 30s, and the soon to be very difficult care situation for baby boomers and beyond, where we have very stretched care, aged care services. Perhaps there is a role for intergenerational care exchange that would solve those two social phenomena.
Well, it's such a cultural issue too, because obviously in a lot of Asian cultures, the elderly parents live, and then you've got your children, and so it's beneficial all the way around. So, is that only in the Western world that we're finding that we need to, that phenomena of failing to launch or failure, that's a phenomena, would you say? Or?
Yeah, I'd agree. So whereas it's very very normal in Asian cultures for multiple generations to live together, and in fact that exchange of ideas between the older generation and the younger generation is one where that experience is valued, whereas in Western cultures, and certainly in Australia, the sense that you need to be independent after 18, 19, get out into the world and really start to fend for yourself in your job, in your relationship, and in your independent accommodations, has set up now a whole generation for failure who can't afford to do that. In Toowoomba, there's more affordable housing. It's still difficult, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, to get a rental, but it's a little bit easier than it would be in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, where even the rental prices for very small units are way outside of young people's budgets, and yet we cast them as failures if they can't live independently, and I still think that's a societal problem that we need to address, and we need to change that narrative.
I'll just remind the listeners that they're on 102.7 FM, and we're in Big Little Small Talk. We're with Dr. Sherree Halliwell. We know now Sherree is a doctor. She's done her PhD, and we're talking about some of the conclusions from that. I know that you have published a lot of articles, and one of them that I saw was "The Interpersonal is Political, Understanding the Sociological Ambivalence Created in Parent and Adult Offspring Cohabitating Relationships," which is what you're talking about. But I suppose when I read that, I thought that it was the younger generation living with the older parents rather than the older adults coming back and looking after aged parents. Is there a difference, do you think? There would be, I suppose, after you're coming home as an adult.
Yeah, there is, and it really is that sense of the societal narrative about failure that is the point at issue. So it's expected that you would live with your parents as a child, as an adolescent, and there's those growing pains of negotiating the relationships in growing up and setting boundaries and so on. But when you come back as an adult living with your adult parent, some of those house rules and just the boundaries that have previously been set, they need renegotiating, and it's not always very clear that they are renegotiated.
Yes. So would your advice be get that out of the way up front?
Absolutely.
Have that conversation. Yeah.
And generally they're often in such a desperate situation that conversation isn't had.
Right. So the conversation needs to be had up front with those rules renegotiated.
It does, because if if you come back into the family home and there's no conversation about things like when you need to be home for dinner, typically, or whether or not a friend can be brought home, particularly a romantic friend, house rules about who watches the television, all of these sorts of things, where there are parent-child conversation, parent sets rules, child might argue, but the parent's word is law. But typically it causes great arguments when you have two adults in a household, one parent, one adult child, and those negotiations, if they're not had, they can cause quite difficult arguments. And when that adult offspring comes back to live, generally they're in a desperate situation. They don't feel able to represent themselves, and that can just leave a kind of seething resentment for a time if they feel that they're living under child rules that are never renegotiated.
And I suppose a lot of, as you said, a lot of people would have had the same experience during COVID. I know our 5 adult sons came home and they're sitting in the lounge room calling out, "Mum, what's for dinner?" I'm like, "I don't cook actually anymore. Your father and I just live on takeaway, and it's your turn to buy a carton of beer, because one round of beers is just about the carton taken up." Yeah, that it's just such an interesting topic for you, and I'm sure many of the listeners are just nodding their heads and feeling the pain, so to speak, from both angles.
That what's for dinner question came up a lot.
Right.
So a 28-year-old coming home and asking what's for dinner, and has my washing been done? And mum saying, "Wait a minute, things have moved on here."
We've all moved on. Can you talk to me about another one of your papers that you've published in another area of interest, which is transgender incarceration?
Yeah. Another really interesting area. I'm part of a research group that is led by Dr. Annette Bronthal at the University of Southern Queensland, and we're working in an area that is, I think probably we would say, an emerging policy area, and it is really about the policies and practices of how we deal with transgender persons who either come into our correctional services as a transgender person, or realise that they're living in a body that's inconsistent with their identity whilst in a corrective service and wish to transition. And the policies and practices that govern people in that situation are particularly difficult because we have gender segregation in our prisons, as we do in schools, and as you hear quite a lot at the moment, particularly around the Commonwealth Games, in our sports. And these are the 3 key areas where there, I think, is a lot of societal interest as well as policy interest in how do we approach dealing with people fairly and respectfully, and respecting their identity when we have these very binary services and institutions which recognise only male or female. So this piece of work is really trying to understand how we create policies and care within the prison service that recognise, respect, and care dutifully for people who are transitioning transgender or transgender in our services. And typically we will still incarcerate somebody who has not had corrective surgery as their birth gender, even if they identify differently. And there are a lot of abuses within the prison service, prisoner on prisoner, for people, and we've heard a lot of stories about particularly females who are incarcerated in the male prison service who haven't had corrective surgery but are and look very feminine, and who are denied a lot of the rights that you'd expect a female prisoner in a female correctional institution to have. So it's a really interesting policy area. It's a really interesting societal concern, and I think it's something that as a sophisticated, caring society we really need to think about carefully, so that we don't double punish people who are hopefully rehabilitated in our services. We don't double punish them with victimisation once they're there.
Well, it's all part of that inclusion. And talking about incarceration, I was listening to a really interesting show last night on the radio about children of incarcerated people and the shame and the stigma that they carry. So that leads me on to my next question, which is about your interest in mental health provision in marginalised communities. I know that you did a project called the Oki Youth Project. Can you talk to me about that and tell the listeners what that involved?
Yeah, the Toowoomba Regional Council and the PHN had a program in the Oki community which was providing services to young people to involve themselves in a whole range of activities. Some of them were just artistic, some were sporting, some were enjoyment of things like painting or games evenings and so on. Some were pool parties. A whole raft of programs for young people. And it was a one-off grant that was providing these services over a period of a year. And wrapped around that were access to mental health services, peer-to-peer counselling services, and training for adults in the community also to be trained in things like counselling and being able to support young people who are struggling into appropriate services. So it was a very holistic program that was targeting specifically Oki, but was intended to be a blueprint for any regional satellite town that whose inhabitants weren't able to travel to a major city to access such services. And the University of Southern Queensland was engaged to research this program, to research its effectiveness, to be able to then provide recommendations to council, but then beyond that, local government and hopefully federal government, and hopefully influence the deployment of funds in those disadvantaged communities. And that piece of research was collaborating with school, with health services, and it was interviewing participants in those programs. And for me, it was wonderful to be able to get out into those communities and give those people a voice who we don't hear often from. And the report that I presented at various different levels of government received a lot of interest. I hope that it then translates to funding for community programs like that. They're incredibly successful at connecting young people to peer support and training adults in the community to be able to help their youngsters as they transition through different and difficult periods of their life through adolescence and into adulthood.
And a big shout out to Julie Cave, who you work closely with as well. Yeah. But does it all come down at the end of the day to funding, though?
Of course, yeah.
Always the funding, isn't it? Yeah. Now, we talked earlier about why we're here, and we're sitting on the stage at the Repertory Theatre interviewing the director, who is also Sherree Halliwell in her numerous incantations of her life. So, is it true or is it not true that you played Mrs. Bennett at Oxford when you were there in Pride and Prejudice?
That's right. So I first adapted this play with a friend of mine at Oxford. She was reading English literature and language at Oxford University, and she wasn't actually at the time studying Austen, but that was her favourite author and also mine. So the two of us were great pals and used to enjoy sort of a book club amongst ourselves discussing Austen's work. And we pondered over whether it was possible to adapt Pride and Prejudice for a garden play set in the grounds of one of our colleges, and whether it could even be done to have a book that has got over 50 chapters brought to life with very little set and just the characters themselves. And we set ourselves the task of having a crack at that. And we did within, I took on the chief role of adapting it. She gave me some wonderful notes, and we did that within a 3-week period. And we then auditioned and got a bunch of actors together, and I was very happy to direct that play. And much like this situation that we have here with COVID, we were due to perform the play, and 3 weeks out we lost our Mrs. Bennett. At the time, due to, I think what was going around, it was strep or something like that. So I had to very quickly move from being a director, not an actor, to taking on the role of Mrs. Bennett. But it was a vibrant, creative, really interesting time, and we had no set really. We played in the garden with just a few bits of furniture, and we used the trees and strung up lanterns around it to give the effect of a chandelier. And because I enjoyed it so much, I've always had it in the back pocket and hoped that wherever I've been, a community theatre might give me a shot at directing it. And I've trotted it around every theatre I've been in London and in Sydney, Albury Wodonga, the Gold Coast, and everybody's raised an eye and said, Sherree, you're dreaming if you're thinking you're going to do this on stage. It's not going to work in our community theatre. And I didn't have much hope for being able to do it in Toowoomba, because I walked into Toowoomba Rep and it's a beautiful traditional theatre. You feel like you're walking back in time, but as I looked around, it actually feels like you're in a 1920s theatre. And so I thought maybe I'm going about it the wrong way, pitching this as a classic 1800s play. Perhaps I should be looking to adapt it for the 1920s. Simplify it. No need for harps and grand pianos and traditional dances. Perhaps if I simplified it into a 1920s production, this actually could work. And if I used a back screen projection, which I've seen here at Rep, perhaps I could evoke the action that you don't see on the stage, and be able to present that on a screen. And so, with not much hope, I pulled together a pitch document and went to the artistic director and said, here's what I'm thinking. And with great surprise, he said, wonderful, we would love to see that. And I think that Toowoomba's audiences would really enjoy Pride and Prejudice. So, oh, wow, brilliant. And then COVID hit, so we had to punt the idea down the road. So that was the first time we had a false start. The second time we were supposed to be on stage in February earlier this year, and then we had the mask regulations come in, and it would have been impossible to do Pride and Prejudice in masks. So that was the second time it was postponed, and hopefully, touching wood, sadly it's a metal table, but touch wood, we're actually going to get to the stage this time. We're due to open basically in 1 week's time, so...
Right. Oh, how nerve-wracking, but what a fantastic story. I'll just remind the listeners that they're with me, Megan O'Hara-Sullivan, and we're in Big Little Small Talk, and we're talking to the director of Pride and Prejudice, Sherree Halliwell, who's just about to take her 1920s adaptation of the 1813 Jane Austen play, Pride and Prejudice. Can you give, for listeners who aren't familiar, God forbid anyone isn't familiar, but with the basic plot of Pride and Prejudice?
For sure, yes. And if you aren't familiar with it, then I would recommend that
quick version
that you see. Yeah, if you want to see a quick version, then there's a movie version that stars Keira Knightley in that titular role, or if you've got 6 hours to spare, the BBC version with Jennifer Ehle and Colin Firth in the Darcy role is definitely a recommendation. But briefly, yes, it's a story really that showcases an independent woman who is determined to break free of the expectations of family, and I particularly resonate with that role, with that character. It's a character who was expected to marry an appropriate person in order to secure her financial future, and she and her sisters are shoehorned towards good marriages, really regardless of the gentleman in question. And she pushes back against that pressure and says, no, I wish to I wish to marry for love, and I would prefer not to marry at all unless I found the person who made my heart sing. And the story really is her meeting and experiencing different relationships with various gentlemen suitors, and finding both herself, I think, and also who she wants to be with in the future and who will make her happy, whilst experiencing a whole host of challenges, as we expect in any novel, that fall in her path. And I just love that sense of a woman on a journey to find herself and to find who she can be her best self with, and sticking at her guns and fighting for what she wants and not being knocked off course by the expectations of others. For me, that's a wonderful story that resonates today.
Do you think it's your story?
It could be, yeah. It could be. For me, though, I think it's probably the career that I felt that the expectations were, if you go to a good university, you get into a good career, you follow a career path and follow it to its end result, which is probably the case for me. And in choosing to leave corporate life and semi-retire to academia, that's where I think I said enough is enough. I'm 40 and I want to do what I want to do with my life. And at that turning point, I was a single lady, never married, in a career that met everybody's expectations, but probably wasn't making me happy. And when I decided, no, I'm going to focus on academia and a career that makes my heart sing, I found myself in Toowoomba and I met the love of my life, who I'm marrying in April. So,
Mr. Darcy.
My Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Darcy. Can you tell me about the grant that you got was it specifically for costumes?
It was, yes. And costuming typically in theatre can be a tricky and expensive thing. And when you have a cast of 17, as I do, Austen paints a lot of characters in her books, then we approached this play with a little bit of trepidation, thinking it could be very tricky to costume a cast of this size. Fortunately, during COVID, the council were offering grants to encourage groups like ours to continue operating, and I think it's really important that we have cultural expression, creative expression in our community, not just means of production, but actually that we keep investing in culture and the arts. And Toowoomba Regional Council has been an amazing supporter in that respect. And when we applied for a grant, not necessarily terribly hopefully, and received a $4,000 grant for our costuming, it really made this possible. So hopefully the audiences will be excited to see the costumes that we're presenting. There's some beautiful 1920s sequins and frills and tassels, so all made possible by Toowoomba Regional Council.
Well, I hadn't got you here as a
no
for that purpose.
But we are incredibly grateful.
Is a disclaimer, not to do with Toowoomba Regional Council. You talked about finding your Mr. Darcy. How did you go in the search for Mr. Darcy for the play?
Oh, we tried to reach out to all sorts of channels. I had an article in the Chronicle. I've been on a couple of different radio stations with my search for Mr. Darcy. We searched through Toowoomba Repertory's Rolodex of male actors, and really that search for Mr. Darcy was a tricky one, because Austen is reasonably specific in the way in which she describes this tall this tall Mr. Darcy whose countenance is proud, and we have got two, I think, in Matthew McFadden and Colin Firth, two very clear ideas of this tall, dark, handsome, brooding Mr. Darcy. And finding a tall, dark, brooding Mr. Darcy who could do an English accent, who was available in Toowoomba, was, I think, going to be a very tricky task. And we were incredibly lucky. It was a moment of serendipity that got us our Mr. Darcy. My actor who I'd cast as Mr. Bingley was out shopping in Grand Central and bumped into a friend who had moved to Brisbane for university, who happened to be in Grand Central for the day, shopping with his parents. And he'd previously performed with my Mr. Bingley and myself in The Mousetrap. And Mr. Bingley mentioned, we're looking for a Darcy. It's really hard work finding a Darcy. And this fellow, Isaac Devlin, said, I'd quite fancy a go at that. And he came along and auditioned for me and was absolutely perfect for the part. Absolute moment of serendipity, because we would have struggled otherwise. We'd had the call out and we hadn't got anyone put their hand up for it.
It's just one of those sliding doors moments, isn't it? Can you tell me the play's starting? Give me the times.
Yeah, it starts on Friday the 12th. That's our first group night. Now, at Toowoomba Repertory Theatre, we have groups that have booked nights and they arrange those themselves. They're
as a means of fundraising for them,
right. Charity and fundraising. So we open with a group night on Friday the 12th. Our main first public opening is the Saturday the 13th, the day after. That's our gala night. And then we have a series of group and public nights that run through to the 27th of August. That's our closing night, Saturday, 27th.
And it's not all nights, is it? You can come to a matinee?
There's a matinee too, and it's the first time in years that we've done a matinee at Rep. We're doing it because we know of the broader appeal of Pride and Prejudice, and we know that some of our patrons don't like to go out at night, so we're putting on a matinee. It's the first Sunday, so Sunday the 14th of August. We're opening up the theatre at 2 p.m. Otherwise, curtains up at 7:30 on the other nights.
Okay. Well, I must admit, I'm not sure what demographic I'm fitting into, but I have got my tickets for the matinee show. I read a review of Pride and Prejudice, and this is what it said. It said, major theme is the importance of environment and upbringing in developing young people's character and morality. Another common theme is ineffectual parents. And I thought, this is you marrying your academia and your artistic side together, isn't it? And we've talked about that a couple of times today with the crossover of themes. So it is your play and the story of your life. Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but Sherree, I'm just going to ask you a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
This is a question that I think you probably have found it hard to nail down. I was going to ask you, what's the most interesting thing you've read lately?
I will probably give you an unexpected answer. So last night I was perusing through Vollo's Guide to Monsters, and I was looking for a particularly tricky monster with which to hit my Dungeons and Dragons group. So I'm a dungeon master in my spare time, and I wanted to really challenge them. So I was flicking through looking for a decent mind flayer or something of that nature. So that's probably one of the most interesting. I found myself a cracking monster to throw at them. Interesting
and completely ununderstandable. I don't know whether there's anyone out there who understood a word of what Sherree just said, but I think there's got to be someone who understands what it is. What about, and you said something about this earlier, what is a fact about you that is not on the internet?
Well, you have done a cracking job with your research, so that's hard. But I have married over 100 people and never been married myself. So, yeah, as a hobby of mine during my 20s and 30s, I was a wedding celebrant. I did that in my weekends. So that used to be my fact that I shared with people. I've married over 100 people, never been married, but April, I'm going to be married for the first time.
What? That is an interesting fact, and I think the listeners would know that that's how Big Little Small Talk was born, because we were going around a group and someone say something that people wouldn't know about you, and yours is that you're also, another string to your bow, you're also a marriage celebrant. Do you still marry people?
I don't, because everyone wants to get married at the weekends, and as my corporate career grew, the only time I had to myself was the weekends, and I found that they were all clogged up with weddings. So I took a break from that, and that break just extended into other hobbies that then filled my weekend. So the last wedding I did was about 6 years ago, but I was at a stage where I was doing 4 during the weekend. So
Tell me about sort of one of the most unusual ones that you ever did.
I had to dress up for a Lord of the Rings wedding, and I had to dress up. There's a picture of me floating about, might even be on the internet, of me dressed as an elf queen for a Lord of the Rings wedding. And as people who know me know, I absolutely loathe the Lord of the Rings. So I had to speak in Elven for part of that ceremony. So that's probably the strangest one.
It does. And I would imagine your standards for your own wedding would be fairly stringent.
Oh, I'm going for the elegant, quintessentially English wedding. And this is because my husband-to-be has actually got roots in England. He's half Dutch, half English by heritage, and he really wanted to lean into that Englishness. So we're going to be married in Richmond in Tasmania, which is very British in style, in a manor house. So it will have the high tea, and it will have a very English flavour to it.
What about Northern England? Does it get a tip in there somewhere?
It does, yeah. We'll probably have some digestive bickies there. Dipped in chocolate, dipped in your tea.
All right. So if I was to put a song on that jukebox over there, there's not really a jukebox here. I don't think there's a 1920s jukebox. If I was to put a song on that gramophone,
yes.
gramophone, and it was going to keep you off, you couldn't stay off the dance floor for it, what song would it be, Sherree?
Yeah, I've got a very, very painfully eclectic music taste, and my favourite genre is everybody's least favourite. I am a massive country music fan. So I suppose it would be painful. It would be, for most people, a painful song, but anything by Dolly Parton, I generally jump on the dance floor, and so no particular song, but any of her catalogue, I would jump up and immediately.
I'm with you, sister. Islands in the Stream, Working 9 to 5.
Those. All of those. Yeah, Islands in the Stream a bit tricky to dance to, but Kenny Rogers as well. You will find actually Kenny Rogers makes an entrance in this play. I've managed to get the It Had to Be You version sung by Kenny Rogers. So if I've managed to squeeze country onto this.
Look, I don't think you'll find too many listeners on 40dB who find country the most painful. I think that might be our demographic. So we might be able to get some of those along to see the play as well.
Listen out for that. It Had to Be You, sung by the marvellous Kenny Rogers.
Isn't that terrific? Well, I love the Dolly Parton podcast, and I don't know whether you've listened to that one. It's Dolly Parton's America. It is probably one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to, and I was a bit of a fan beforehand, but I became a massive fan and admirer of all of her skills after I listened to that. I was going to ask you about podcasts. Do you listen to any podcasts, and what are your go-tos?
So an interesting thing again about me that's not on the internet, I suppose, is that I've never listened to a single podcast. Not even ones that I've been on myself, interviewed for. And I have a whole list of podcasts I want to listen to, and TED Talks I want to listen to, and when I get some spare time, now that I've finished my PhD, and once I've done P&P here at Rep Theatre, I shall spend some time actually listening to some podcasts that I've got on a list of to-dos that I'm really, really excited to listen to.
Yeah, that list is getting longer, and I don't think listening to the ones with you on it would probably be the
No, they wouldn't be so
list.
edifying. No, but I've never even listened to those, sadly.
Yeah, can I recommend Dolly Parton's America is probably one of the most favourite.
Megan.
All right, my very last question, we're running out of time, is who is your favourite royal? Now, this person doesn't have to be an English person and doesn't have to be alive.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, that one. I am renowned as being a staunch Republican. Unusual, possibly, for a Brit in Australia. But I have, politically, am typically known to be someone who has campaigned actually for the slow and happy dissolution of the British monarchy. But I'm also a very proud Brit and proud of my history and proud of my culture. And looking back over the history of the British monarchy, Elizabeth I is by far and away my, favourite monarch. Just what she was able to achieve in a time dominated by men. And she's, again, much like my Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice, stuck to her guns. And whether you agree with the history of the time, I just think that is a strong, independent woman who would brook no nonsense from those around her. And she certainly had an incredible influence on the history that followed. From a very, very tricky start in life with with her father, Henry VIII. And again, much like the ineffectual parenting of our Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice, she was able to strike out her own path and chart that path successfully. So I think probably looking across my history, my culture, she's the one who really stands out as a role model monarch.
What a perfect answer. And that, unfortunately, has brought our time to an end. Sherree, your varied career, your interests, your dynamicism, your interest in so many different facets of life has just been wonderful to hear about today, and I really appreciate you being my guest on Big Little Small Talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me on this show, Megan. I look forward to watching or hearing your further shows when I have more time to myself to listen.
Very good. Thank you. That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.